The morning Clara Whitmore was put up for auction, the sky over Blackstone Ridge was the color of a bad bruise. Purple and gray and wrong, the way skies only get before something terrible finishes arriving. She had been awake since before dawn. Not because she chose to be, but because Nora had been fussing since 2 in the morning, and there was no longer a crib to lay her in, no longer a rocking chair by the window, no longer a window that belonged to Clara at all. The room she'd spent the night in was a back storage space behind the county clerk's office. 4 bare walls, a dirt floor, and a single wool blanket that smelled of horse. She had sat with her back against the wall, nursing Nora in the dark, listening to the town outside slowly wake up, and she had not cried. She had finished with crying 2 days ago. It had taken Sheriff Grady Polk and 2 deputies to come to her door the previous Monday, and even then she'd made them wait on the porch while she dressed herself properly, because she was not going to give any of them the satisfaction of seeing her undone. They had the paperwork. They always had the paperwork. The late Robert Whitmore, her husband of 14 months, had apparently signed his name to debts Clara had never been told about. Notes against the land, against the livestock, against the house itself. Robert had been dead for 3 months, dead of a fever that moved faster than any doctor in the territory could keep up with, leaving behind a young wife, an infant daughter, and a ledger full of obligations that added up to more than everything he'd owned. Clara had stood in the doorway and read every line of every document while the deputies shifted their weight and avoided her eyes. She'd asked questions, specific, careful questions. Deputy Marsh had answered a few of them. Sheriff Polk had not answered any. "It's the law, Mrs. Whitmore," was all he'd said. She'd handed the papers back, turned around, and started packing. She took only what fit in one carpet bag: 2 dresses, Nora's things, the photograph of her own mother taken in 1861, a small knife she'd owned since she was 16, and the $43 she'd kept folded inside a jar of dried beans at the back of the kitchen shelf. The one place, apparently, that Robert had not thought to mortgage. The creditors arrived the next morning and took the rest. Now it was Thursday, and the auction was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the square, and Clara was going to walk out there with her daughter in her arms and stand on that platform and let them look at her, because that was the only move left on the board. The idea was not complicated. A woman with a nursing infant and no family, no land, no employment, and $43 was not going to survive a frontier winter on her own. Someone would buy her contract of labor. It was legal. It was common enough out here. Women in desperate circumstances were sometimes auctioned off as household workers, and the man or family who purchased the contract was obligated, by paper, if not always by conscience, to provide room and board in exchange for domestic labor. It wasn't slavery. It was close enough to slavery that Clara had spent 2 days trying to find any other solution before accepting that there wasn't one. What made it worse was that she knew some of the people who would be watching. Mabel Cortez from this dry goods store, who had been perfectly kind to Clara for 14 months, and would now watch her stand on an auction block with the same expression she wore while examining bolts of inferior fabric. Old Stanton from the feed mill, who had shaken Robert's hand 100 times and would now probably bid $2 on Robert's widow just to have someone to scrub his floors. And the Braddock brothers, 3 of them, all employed by the Ridge Land Company, all present at every public gathering where some piece of misfortune was available to be witnessed and commented upon. Clara buttoned Nora's blanket up to her chin, stood up from the floor, and straightened her back. She was 24 years old. She was 5'3" and broad across the shoulders, with hands that had done real work her whole life, and a face that had never been called pretty. Sturdy, her mother had always said, which was the kindest word available. She had brown eyes and dark hair she kept pinned back tight, because loose hair was impractical, and she'd had a slight gap between her front teeth since childhood that she'd spent 24 years trying not to think about. None of it mattered anymore. She tucked Nora against her chest, picked up her carpet bag, and walked out to face whatever was coming. The square was already crowded when Clara arrived with Deputy Marsh, who had been assigned the task of escorting her and seemed to wish he'd been assigned something else instead. He walked half a step behind her, which she noticed and chose not to comment on. The auction platform was a rough wooden structure that got dragged out of storage 3 or 4 times a year for various public proceedings. Today it had been set up in front of the courthouse steps, which Clara thought was an especially ugly piece of staging, the law presiding over its own machinery. There were maybe 200 people in the square, which was most of Blackstone Ridge. Some had come to bid, most had come to watch. Clara climbed the 3 steps to the platform and stood. For a moment there was a kind of hush, not the respectful kind. The kind that comes when a crowd realizes the spectacle they've come to see is a real person standing in front of them, and some of them haven't quite made peace with that yet. She looked straight ahead, not at faces, not at anything specific. She held Nora against her left shoulder and kept her right hand at her side and made herself breathe slowly. County Clerk Aldous Finch climbed up beside her, holding his papers. He was a small man with wire spectacles and the look of someone who had processed so many human disasters that he'd stopped seeing them as disasters and now saw them only as paperwork. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, in the flat voice of a man reading a grocery list, "we are here today for the contract auction of Mrs. Clara Ann Whitmore, widow, formerly of the Whitmore land claim on the North Fork of Cutter Creek. The minimum labor contract period is 1 year. All bidders must—" "How much for just the woman?" someone in the back called out. And there was ugly laughter, the kind that spreads fast in a crowd that's already in the mood for it. Clara's jaw tightened. She did not look toward the voice. "All bidders must be registered with the county," Finch continued, raising his voice slightly over the dying laughter. "Bidding will commence at— I'll start at $10. That was Stanton. She recognized his voice without looking. Of course it was Stanton. 15, said another voice she didn't recognize. 18, 20. The numbers climbed in small, unimpressive increments, the kind of increments that told you exactly what the bidders thought the thing being auctioned was worth. Clara stared at the middle distance and thought about nothing, or tried to. Nora made a small sound against her shoulder, not quite a cry, just a movement toward one, and Clara shifted her weight automatically and patted the baby's back and kept her eyes forward. 25, Stanton said. 25 to Jeremiah Stanton, Finch announced. Do I have $150? The voice came from the back left edge of the crowd. It was not a loud voice. It didn't need to be, because the number was so far beyond anything else that had been said that it landed in the square like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples spread outward in the form of turned heads and dropped jaws, and a silence so total that Clara could hear Nora breathing. She turned her head toward the voice. The man making his way through the crowd was tall, not exceptionally so, but tall enough, with the kind of build that came from actual outdoor work, rather than the practiced broadness some men cultivated for show. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, dark-haired, going a little gray at the temples, wearing trail clothes that were clean but not new. His face was angular and weathered, with a jaw that looked like it had been set in permanent disagreement with something, and dark eyes that were currently fixed not on Clara, but on Finch, with an expression of flat, businesslike attention. She didn't know him. The crowd knew him, though. She could tell by the way they parted for him, not enthusiastically, but the way people move for something large that they're not entirely sure about. She caught a few whispered names. Cole, Dawson Cole. The sound of the name moved through the crowd the way a cold draft moves through a room. He stopped at the base of the platform and looked up at Finch. $150, he said again, for the full contract, both of them. Finch blinked. Mr. Cole, the infant is not— The infant goes where her mother goes, Cole said. It wasn't aggressive. It was the same tone he might have used to point out that the sun was overhead. I'm not separating a nursing child from her mother. If that's a problem with the terms, I'll buy the contract outright and increase the offer. A long silence. Stanton cleared his throat somewhere in the crowd. Now hold on, Dawson. Nobody said— Stanton. Cole didn't turn around. You have 15 acres of good pasture and you need a cook, not a woman with a baby. Sit down. There was a brief collective intake of breath from the crowd, not because it was rude, but because it was accurate, and accuracy delivered without cruelty has a way of silencing a room that insults never quite manage. Stanton sat down. Finch shuffled his papers. The bid is $150 for the labor contract of Mrs. Clara Whitmore, with the provision that the infant daughter accompanies. Do I have any further? No one spoke. Sold, Finch said, with the exhausted relief of a man who just wants to go back to his office. Clara came down off the platform on her own, without waiting for anyone to help her, and she walked to where Cole was standing by himself a few feet from the crowd. He watched her come without any particular expression, which she noticed. Most men had some expression on their face when she walked toward them. This one just waited. She stopped in front of him. "Mr. Cole." "Mrs. Whitmore." Up close he was more tired-looking than she'd expected. Not weary in the soft way of someone who'd slept badly. Tired in the deep carved way of someone who had been dealing with something hard for a long time and had gotten good at not showing it. His eyes were brown, she realized, not the dark she'd thought from a distance. "I need to understand what I've agreed to," she said. "Fair enough." "I'm a contract laborer, not a servant, not—" She stopped. "You understand the distinction?" "Yes." "And my daughter?" "She comes with you. I said that plainly. She'll need feeding every few hours. She's not old enough to sleep through the night. If you're expecting uninterrupted household service at 6 in the morning, you'll need to adjust your expectations." Something crossed his face, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have a ranch with 11 hands, a cook who's been threatening to quit for 3 years, and a house that's got 2 broken windows and a porch that needs rebuilding. I'm not expecting anything to be convenient." Clara looked at him for a moment. "How far is your ranch?" 4 hours south, maybe 4.5 in a wagon. "When do we leave?" "As soon as you're ready." She shifted Nora to her other arm and picked up her carpet bag. "I'm ready now." The wagon was a working ranch wagon. No cushions, no cover, just a wooden bench seat up front and a flatbed behind that still had straw on it from its last load of something agricultural. A young ranch hand named Eli, maybe 19, sat in the driver's seat and looked at Clara with the open-mouthed uncertainty of someone who had been told to bring a wagon to town and was not entirely sure what was happening. Cole helped her up onto the bench seat, not in a way that suggested she couldn't manage herself, but in the practical way of someone offering a hand because the step was high, and she was carrying a baby. She noticed the difference. Eli clicked the horses forward, and the wagon moved out of the square. Clara did not look back at the crowd. She didn't see the point. For a while no one spoke. Eli kept his eyes on the road. Cole sat beside her on the bench with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, and seemed to have no particular objection to silence, which Clara appreciated more than she would have expected. Nora slept. The road south was rough in the first few miles. Blackstone Ridge's main street bled out into packed dirt, and then into something that was more suggestion than road. And the wagon jostled badly enough that Clara braced herself against the side rail with her free arm and tucked Nora tighter. The baby stirred once, and then settled back. When they'd been traveling about 40 minutes, Cole said, "I should tell you some things." "Probably," Clara said. He was quiet for another moment, like he was deciding where to start. "The ranch is called Cole Ridge. It's been in my family since my father built it, 32 years ago. I run cattle to about 600 head right now, more in spring. The house is large enough. You and your daughter will have your own room." "And my duties?" "The house needs managing. The current cook, his name is Hector, does the cooking, but he's 63 and his back is bad, and I'm not going to pretend he's managing everything. There's cleaning, laundry, some supply ordering when we get to town once a month. If you can keep accounts, I'd use that too." "I can keep accounts," Clara said. My husband wasn't careful with records. I did most of it." Cole nodded without any commentary on Robert Whitmore that she could detect. "Then that would be useful." "What else?" He looked at her sideways. "What do you mean?" "You paid $150 for a labor contract," she said. "The going rate for that is $40, maybe $50 for someone with skills, so there's something else." A long pause. "You're direct," he said. "I don't see the value in not being." He turned back to the road. "The ranch has had some trouble lately, not the kind of trouble that a hired man solves. I needed someone in the house who is calm, who doesn't panic, who can hold things together if something goes wrong when I'm not there." Clara looked at him. "That's a strange thing to buy at an auction." "I know." "You could have just hired someone." "I could have," he said, "but I needed someone who had a reason to stay." He said it plainly, without apology. Someone with a stake in the situation, someone who needed the arrangement as much as I did. It was an honest thing to say. Clara hated that she respected him for saying it. "What kind of trouble?" she asked. "Old business," he said. "Nothing that's reached the house yet." "Yet," she said. Yet, he agreed. She thought about that for a while. The road smoothed out as they moved south, prairie grass on both sides going gold in the October sun, and somewhere ahead of them the land began to roll upward toward the low hills that marked the edge of the Coal Ridge country. She'd seen it from a distance before, from the road to her own former home on the North Fork. She'd always thought it looked well maintained, properly fenced, good pasture, the kind of land that showed regular attention. "I need you to know," she said finally, "that I am not a woman who can be ordered around." "I can see that. And I'm not going to be grateful in a way that means I don't ask questions or object to things that are wrong. I wouldn't want you to be. And my daughter," her voice caught slightly, just once, like a foot finding an unexpected step. She recovered it. "My daughter is not a complication or an inconvenience to be managed. She is a person. She matters." Cole turned to look at her then, and something in his face changed. Not softened exactly, but opened, the way a window opens when the latch is released. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I paid $150 specifically so that your daughter would go with you. She matters to me too. I want that to be clear." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she asked. She hadn't. He turned back to the road. A muscle worked in his jaw. "I had a younger brother," he said. "He died when he was 9. He died because there was no one to look after him when he needed looking after, and I have spent a long time thinking about that." He stopped. "I'm not going to let a child go without a father if I can help it." Clara said nothing for a while. Then she said, "Her name is Nora." He glanced down at the baby, who had one fist pressed against her cheek and was sleeping with the absolute commitment that only infants and the very old seem to manage. "Nora," he said, as if testing the weight of it. "She's 4 months old. She doesn't sleep through the night, like I said. She's good-tempered generally. She likes being moved, rocking, or riding, which is why she's asleep right now." Clara paused. "She doesn't have a father." "No," Cole said. "She doesn't have anything," Clara said. It came out quieter than she meant it to. "She has me and $43 and the clothes on her back." Cole looked straight ahead at the road. "She has a place to sleep now," he said. "And so do you." It was not a grand statement. It was not particularly eloquent. Clara had been told beautiful things by people who didn't mean them, and she'd come to prefer plain things said by people who did. She turned her face toward the prairie and watched the grass move in the wind and said nothing at all, and somehow that felt like the right response. They stopped once, 2 hours in, at a wide, flat place where Eli watered the horses at a creek. Clara climbed down and walked a short distance away from the wagon. Not far, just enough, and nursed Nora sitting on a flat rock in the sun. The afternoon had warmed up, the strange, thin warmth of October that feels borrowed because it is, and she tilted her face up into it and tried to sort through the last 6 hours. She was on her way to a stranger's ranch. She had been bought at auction. Her husband was 3 months dead and had left her nothing but trouble. She had $43, a 4-month-old daughter, and a carpet bag. The man who had bought her contract seemed, so far, to be neither cruel nor dishonest, but she'd been wrong about people before, and the cost of being wrong again was not something she could afford. She looked down at Nora. Nora had her eyes open now, the dark, slightly unfocused eyes of a baby who is awake but not yet requiring anything specific. She looked up at Clara with the absolute trust of someone who has no information about danger. Clara put her thumb in the baby's palm and felt the small fingers close around it, automatic and sure. "We're going to be all right," Clara told her. It was not a certainty. It was a promise, the kind you make to someone who can't hold you to it yet, which means you hold yourself to it instead. When she walked back to the wagon, Cole was standing by the horses talking to Eli in a low voice. He stopped when she approached, not in a guilty way, but in the simple way of someone finishing a conversation. Eli took his position at the front. Cole offered his hand to help her up again. She took it without comment. They reached Coal Ridge as the sun was going orange on the horizon, and Clara's first impression was of scale. The house was large in the functional way of ranch houses that had been added onto over time. A core structure of native stone, 2 stories, with a wide porch running the length of the front, and 2 wings that had been added in different eras, distinguishable by the slight differences in the stone and the way the roof lines didn't quite match. It was not pretty. It was solid. There were indeed 2 broken windows on the east-facing wall, one patched with oilskin, one just open to the October air with a rag stuffed in the corner. The porch had a section of railing missing, but the yard was clean and the corral fences were straight, and the barn behind the house was enormous and in good repair, which told Clara something about the man's priorities that she filed away without comment. 3 ranch hands came out of the barn when the wagon pulled in and watched her with the cautious neutrality of men trying to figure out what they were supposed to think. Cole climbed down and introduced them in his flat, economical way. Tom Briggs, the foreman, a heavy-set man of 50 with a gray beard and eyes that had seen considerable frontier weather. Cyrus, who was young and lean and looked at the baby with an expression of pure alarm. And Dutch, who had a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth and said nothing but nodded once when his name was used. "Mrs. Whitmore will be managing the house," Cole said. "She and her daughter have the east room upstairs. Anyone needs something from the house, you go through her." Tom Briggs looked at Clara with an evaluating sort of attention. Not hostile, more like a man watching to see what the new horse does in the first few minutes. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Briggs," she said. A silence. Then he nodded, turned, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. The others followed. Cole showed her inside. The kitchen was large and smelled of wood smoke and old grease and coffee. Hector, the 63-year-old cook who'd been threatening to quit, was a small Mexican man with a magnificent white mustache and the expression of someone who had been waiting to be relieved of responsibility for quite some time. He looked at Clara, looked at the baby, looked back at Clara, and said something in Spanish that she didn't catch. "He says welcome," Cole said. "What did he actually say?" Clara asked. A slight pause from Cole, then from Hector, a much longer and more detailed speech in Spanish. "He says thank everything that has ever existed that someone else is going to take over the supply ordering," Cole said. And there was something in his voice that might have been the beginning of wry humor trying to find its footing. Clara looked at Hector. "Tell him I'll be ready to start tomorrow." Hector nodded vigorously and went back to his stove. The east room was at the back of the upper floor, facing the barn and the open land beyond. It had a bed, real bed, with a frame and a mattress, not a pallet, and a small dresser and a washstand and a rocking chair that someone had placed near the window, which Clara was nearly certain hadn't been there before today and did not ask about. There was a small crate by the bed lined with folded wool, built at the right dimensions to serve as a crib. Clara stood in the middle of the room and looked at the crate for a long moment. Cole had stopped in the doorway. He didn't come in. "If it's not right," he started. "It's right," she said. Her voice was doing something she needed it not to do. She took a breath and held it for a count of 3. "It's right, thank you." He nodded. "There's water heating downstairs if you want to wash. Supper in an hour." "Mr. Cole," he stopped. "Why?" she said again. Not the same question as before. Something more specific. "The crate. The rocking chair. You prepared this before you went to the auction today." A pause. The hallway was dim and she couldn't read his face clearly from where she stood. "I knew there was a child," he said. "I made inquiries before I came to town." Another pause. "I thought someone should have something ready." Clara didn't say anything. "Supper in an hour," he said again, and his footsteps moved away down the hall. She stood in the room until she was sure she heard him reach the bottom of the stairs. Then she sat on the edge of the bed with Nora against her shoulder and let herself do the thing she'd been refusing to do since Monday morning. She shook with it, silently, her face in the baby's blanket so no sound would carry, her whole body trembling with the accumulated weight of the week, the auction, and the deputies, and the stripped house, and the wool blanket on the dirt floor and $43 in a jar, and Robert signing his name to things he should have told her about. She cried until she was empty. Then she wiped her face, settled Nora in the wool-lined crate, poured water from the pitcher into the basin, and washed her hands and face in the cold water until she felt like herself again. She was 24 years old, and she was starting over with nothing, in a stranger's house, on a frontier she barely knew. There were things to be afraid of here. She'd heard enough in Cole's careful words to know that. Old trouble. Men he hadn't mentioned. Things that hadn't reached the house yet. She looked at her own face in the small mirror above the washstand, plain and tired and alive. She straightened her hair, adjusted her collar, and went downstairs to eat supper at someone else's table. It was not much, but it was a beginning. Supper was biscuits and gravy and a side of something Hector called frijoles that Clara ate without question because she was hungry enough to eat the tablecloth. Tom Briggs and Cyrus and Dutch came in from the bunkhouse and ate at the long kitchen table with the wordless efficiency of working men who regard meals as fuel. Cole sat at the head of the table and ate with the same economy he seemed to bring to everything. Clara sat in the middle of the table with Nora in her lap, which she'd been prepared to defend if anyone objected. No one did. The conversation was minimal and practical. Something about a fence on the South Range, something about cattle counts, a delivery expected from Blackstone Ridge sometime next week. Clara listened and ate and said nothing, building the geography of the place in her mind. After supper, Tom Briggs stopped near the kitchen door on his way out. He had the look of a man who'd made a decision during the meal. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "The east window, the one that's open. I saw it. There's glass in the barn loft, bought 3 months ago, but nobody's gotten to it. I'll mention it to Mr. Cole." "No need." A pause. "I'll get Cyrus on it tomorrow morning, before the cold sets in proper." He nodded once, the same single nod he'd given her when they were introduced, and went out. Clara looked at the door after it closed. It wasn't much. It was a man choosing to fix a window without being asked, in a house she'd been living in for 4 hours, and it was more than she'd had reason to expect from anyone today. She thought about that as she carried Nora upstairs and settled her back in the wool crate and listened to the house creak and settle around her in the October dark. "Old trouble," Cole had said. "Nothing that's reached the house yet." She lay on her back on the real mattress and stared at the ceiling and thought about what kind of trouble waited on a frontier ranch and what kind of man paid 6 times the going rate for a woman and her child so that the child wouldn't be separated from her mother. And she thought about the crate lined with wool and the rocking chair placed by the window. And she thought about her $43 tucked back in the jar of dried beans she'd brought in her carpet bag, because some habits are hard to break. She had survived a week that should have ended her. She had a room, a real bed, a crate for Nora, and a window that would have glass in it by morning. It was not enough to trust, not yet, but it was enough to start from. Downstairs, she heard Cole's footsteps moving through the house, steady, slow, the last person awake going through the last rounds of the night, and then the particular sound of a front door being checked and locked. Clara closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would learn the house. She would find the supply ledgers and figure out what Hector needed, and what the broken things were, and what needed to be ordered before winter came. She would ask questions that needed asking, and she would do the work she'd been brought here to do, and she would watch, carefully, for the shape of whatever trouble was coming from the direction Cole hadn't described. She was not safe yet. She was not certain of anything yet, but she was here, and Nora was warm, and for tonight, that was enough. The glass went into the east window the next morning, like Tom Briggs had said it would. Clara heard Cyrus out there before sunrise, the scrape of the old frame being pulled, the careful tapping of new glass being set. And she lay still in the gray half-light and listened to someone fixing something in a house she'd been living in for less than 12 hours. It was a small thing. It kept striking her as larger than it was. Nora woke at 5:30, which was approximately when she always woke, and Clara fed her in the rocking chair by the now intact window and watched the sky outside go from black to purple to the cold pale blue of an October dawn over open country. The barn was already lit. She could see lantern light through the gap under the barn doors and hear the low sounds of men starting their morning work. Horses, feed, the creak of a gate being opened. A ranch in early morning was its own kind of machinery, and it had been running long before she arrived and would run long after she understood it. She dressed, settled Nora in the wool crate with a folded blanket wedged along one side so she couldn't roll, and went downstairs to find the kitchen. Hector was already at the stove, moving with the careful economy of a man whose back hurt, but who had long since decided that complaining about it was a waste of time. He looked up when she came in and said something in Spanish and pointed at the coffee. "Thank you," she said, and poured herself a cup and stood at the kitchen window drinking it while the morning came in through the glass. The kitchen was the kind of room that told you a great deal about who ran it. It was functional rather than comfortable. Good equipment, well organized, but showing the particular kind of disorder that accumulates when a man has been cooking for a household full of other men with no particular eye towards system. The supply shelf had cans in no particular order, some facing forward and some not. a jar of salt sitting next to a jar of lard with nothing between them labeled. The account ledger for household supplies was on the far end of the table, and when Clara picked it up and opened it, she found entries made in at least 3 different handwritings, some in pencil, some in ink, several crossed out and replaced without explanation. She set it back down and drank more coffee. "The ledger," she said, and looked at Hector. "Who kept it before?" Hector gave her a complicated look. "Senor Cole," he said. "And me. And sometimes Tom." "And the last supply order?" "6 weeks ago." Clara looked at the shelf. "You're low on flour." "See." "And you're out of baking powder entirely." A pause. "See? How have you been making biscuits?" Hector looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has made peace with certain compromises. "Badly," he said. Clara set down her coffee cup, found an empty page in the ledger, and started writing. She had a working list by the time the ranch hands came in for breakfast, and a modified list by the time she'd watched Hector cook for 20 minutes, and identified 3 other things he'd been managing without. She did not say anything about any of it at breakfast. She ate, refilled coffee where it needed refilling, and watched the rhythm of the table, who spoke, who didn't, what the silences meant. Cole ate fast and talked little at breakfast, which she'd already identified as a pattern from supper the night before. Tom Briggs ate slow and talked when something needed saying. Cyrus talked too much in the way of young men who are nervous and fill silence with noise. Dutch still didn't talk at all, but he watched everything, and Clara had been watched enough in her life to recognize the difference between watching that was menacing and watching that was simply how some people process the world. Dutch was the second kind. After the hands went back out, Cole remained at the table with his coffee, looking at something in his own head that Clara couldn't see. "I need to make a supply run," she said, sitting down across from him with her list. She slid it across the table. He looked at it without picking it up. "Eli goes to town every other Monday. Next one is in 8 days. We're out of baking powder. And there are 4 other things on that list that Hector has been substituting for or going without. I can make the biscuits work for another 8 days, but the coffee situation is going to get ugly by Wednesday." Cole looked at the list. Then he picked it up. He read it in the careful way of someone who reads everything twice before responding, which she was beginning to recognize as a general habit. "I'll have Eli take a wagon Friday," he said. "I'll go with him." A brief pause. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to know who the suppliers are and what prices we're paying. If I'm keeping the accounts, I need to know the full picture." He set the list down, looked at her. "All right. And I'll need to know what the household budget is, the actual number. I'll write it down for you." Today, something in his expression, not irritation, more like recalibration, the look of a man who has been running things a certain way and is adjusting to a different set of questions. "Today," he said. He wrote it down before he went out to work. Clara folded the paper and put it in her pocket and stood at the kitchen window watching the yard and thinking about how much she could do with that number if she was careful with it. The days found their shape. It was not easy, and it was not comfortable, but it was structured, which Clara had always found to be the next best thing to safe. She was up before light, downstairs by 5:30, working with Hector in the kitchen until breakfast was done, then through the house. There was a great deal to do, the kind of accumulated disorder that happens when a house is occupied mostly by men who are outdoors most of the day and regard interior spaces as places to sleep and eat rather than places to maintain. She found a closet full of linens that hadn't been properly aired in what smelled like 2 seasons. She found a leak in the washroom ceiling that had been dripping into a bucket someone had placed there and apparently forgotten. She found a box in the pantry that had held potatoes sometime last spring and had been slowly becoming part of the floor. She didn't complain about any of it. She just worked. Nora traveled with her through most of it, strapped to her front in a length of fabric she'd fashioned from an old shawl, the baby's face against her chest and her small fists curled up near her chin. Clara had been doing this since Nora was 6 weeks old, long before the creditors came. It kept her hands free and the baby quiet, and Nora seemed to find the constant movement settling rather than disturbing. Hector watched this arrangement with an expression of deep approval and said so, at length, in Spanish. "I know," Clara said, without knowing exactly what he'd said. On the 3rd day, she reorganized the supply shelf. On the 4th day, she found the leak's source, a cracked shingle on the roof directly above the washroom, and told Tom Briggs, who looked at it and said he'd have Cyrus on the roof by afternoon. On the 5th day, she started working through the household ledger from the beginning, not just the recent entries, trying to build a picture of how the ranch spent its domestic money and where it was hemorrhaging without reason. What she found there made her go still at the kitchen table for a full minute. The household accounts were not in bad shape. But there was a pattern in them she recognized from her own experience with Robert's papers. Line items that were vague where they should be specific, payments made to suppliers she couldn't find cross-referenced anywhere else, and a recurring expense listed only as Ridge Company fee that appeared once a month, every month for the past 3 years, and was not small. She didn't say anything about it yet. She wrote it down on a separate piece of paper and folded it and put it in the same pocket as the budget number and kept working. What? The Friday supply run was informative in several ways. Eli drove. Clara sat on the bench beside him with Nora strapped to her chest and a list in her coat pocket and her $43 still in the carpet bag. She had not spent Cole's household money on anything yet that she couldn't account for in writing, and she wasn't going to start now. Blackstone Ridge looked different coming back to it than it had leaving. Or maybe she looked different. She sat up straight on the wagon bench and did not look away from anyone who stared at her on the main street, which several people did. The woman from the auction, 4 days later, coming back to town on a Cole Ridge wagon, like she'd always belonged there. She met every look without expression. Eli was nervous about being in town with her. She could tell. He kept glancing at her sideways, waiting for her to be upset, which was kind in a fumbling sort of way. "I'm fine, Eli," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Stop looking at me like I'm about to break." He looked straight ahead, very hard. "Yes, ma'am." She almost smiled. The main supplier for Cole Ridge was a general store run by a man named Garrett Voss, who was in his 50s and had the manner of someone who had been in business long enough to care mainly about the transaction. He knew the Cole Ridge account. He looked at Clara with professional neutrality when she introduced herself and produced her list. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "you're managing the house now?" "I am. You'll want to look at the account tab then." He reached under the counter and produced a ledger of his own. Cole Ridge is current, but they've been ordering less than they used to. Last year's winter order was about 60% of what it was the year before. "I noticed the pantry seemed light," she said. "We'll be increasing the order, starting today." She put her list on the counter. He looked it over. "This is more organized than what we usually get from Cole Ridge." "I imagine so," she said. She spent an hour in Voss's store, going through the list item by item, asking about prices and supplier sources and whether there were better deals available on any of the staples. Voss, to his credit, answered her honestly and pointed out 2 things on her list where he had cheaper alternatives without her asking. She thanked him and made the substitutions. On the way home, Eli said, "Mr. Cole's going to be surprised." "At what?" "How much you got for the money?" Clara looked at the loaded wagon bed behind them. "That's basic accounting," she said. "It's not impressive. It's just paying attention." Eli thought about that. "Mr. Cole doesn't really pay attention to the house stuff," he said, in the careful way of someone sharing information they hope is useful rather than disloyal. "I've noticed," she said. He's got a lot of other things." "I know." A pause. The road south rolled out ahead of them. "He's a good man," Eli said. I don't want you to think he isn't, because he doesn't talk much." Clara looked at the boy. He was 19 or thereabouts, with an honest face and the look of someone who had decided the best policy was sincerity even when it was risky. She thought about what it meant that he felt the need to say it. "I don't think he isn't," she said. "I'm still deciding what I think, but I don't think he isn't." Eli seemed to find this satisfactory. He clicked the horses forward and they rode the rest of the way home without much conversation. And it was a comfortable kind of quiet rather than an uncomfortable one. That evening, after supper, Clara put the remaining household money and the receipt for everything she'd spent on the table in front of Cole. He looked at the receipt, then at the remaining money, then at her. "You spent less than I gave you," he said. "I spent what the things cost," she said. "Voss had cheaper salt. I asked." He looked at the receipt again. "You got twice what I usually order for the same money." "For slightly less money," she said. "You had some budget left over." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, I haven't been paying close enough attention to the house accounts. No, she agreed without cruelty. Another pause. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down. There's a line item in the household ledger, Clara said, because she'd decided in the wagon that tonight was when she was going to ask. Recurring, Ridge Company fee, every month for 3 years. The room changed. Not dramatically. He didn't flinch, didn't reach for anything. But something in him went still in a particular way, the way things go still when someone presses on a bruise they didn't know was visible. That's not a household expense, he said. I know, but it's in the household ledger. It was put there by mistake, early on. He looked at the table. I'll move it to the ranch accounts. What is it? A silence. Mr. Cole, she kept her voice level. You told me there was old trouble. You said it hadn't reached the house yet. And there's a recurring payment to a company called Ridge Company in the household accounts going back 3 years. And when I asked Garrett Voss about it this afternoon, he went very quiet and said he didn't know anything about Ridgeco. Cole looked at her. His jaw was doing the tight thing she'd started to learn, meant he was working out how much to say. Voss knows something about Ridge Company, he said. He went quiet, Clara said. That's knowing something. A long moment. Cole stood up, walked to the window, stood with his back to her looking out at the dark yard. The lamp on the table cast his shadow long against the wall. The Ridge Land Company, he said, has been buying up land in this valley for 4 years. They make offers. When people don't take the offers, they find reasons to make things difficult. Water rights disputes, supply interruptions, accidents. He stopped. They've been applying pressure to Coal Ridge for 3 years. The payment it's complicated. Is it blackmail? Silence. Mr. Cole? It's leverage, he said. There's a difference. Is there? He turned around. His face was difficult to read in the lamplight, but she could see the tiredness in it. Not the surface tiredness of too little sleep, but the deeper kind, the kind that accumulates when someone has been carrying something alone for a long time. There's something from my past, he said. Something that happened when I was younger and stupider and less careful. The Ridge Land Company found out about it. They've been using it to keep me cooperative. A pause. Cooperative meaning I don't organize resistance when they go after the smaller ranches around me. Clara looked at him. You've been paying them to leave your neighbors alone? She said. I've been paying them to leave me alone, yeah, he said. The neighbors. That's what I've been trading away. His voice was flat, but not indifferent. Flat in the way of someone who knows what they've done and has stopped defending it. If I fight them, they release what they have on me. If I don't fight them, they leave Coal Ridge alone and keep absorbing everything around it. And in 5 years, there won't be anything left but Coal Ridge. And it'll be surrounded by Ridge Land Company property, and they'll own the water rights, and it'll just be slower. He stopped. I know what I've been doing. Then why are you still doing it? Because I haven't figured out how to stop without losing everything. The fire crackled. Outside, one of the horses moved in the corral. What did you do? She asked. The thing from your past. I told you about my brother, he said. You told me he died. He died because I wasn't there. He stopped. The thing in his face was worse than sadness. It was the particular expression of someone who has rehearsed a guilt so many times it's worn down to something almost like fact. I was 22. I was supposed to be watching him. I went to town instead. He wandered into the South Range during the night, and the temperature dropped, and by the time anyone found him, it was too late. A long pause. That's not the part they have. The part they have is that I was in town because I was meeting someone I shouldn't have been meeting. A man named Calloway, who was running a card operation and had some other businesses that weren't legal. I took money from him once to relay a message between parties. I didn't know what the message was. I didn't ask. His mouth tightened. I know now. Calloway was involved in a land fraud scheme that eventually cost 3 families everything they owned. My one message was one piece of a very long chain, and I didn't know about the chain, but not knowing isn't the same as not being involved. Clara said nothing. The Ridge Land Company found Calloway. He's dead now, but his records aren't. They have a letter I wrote. My handwriting, my signature, the relay message. Taken out of context, it looks exactly like what they'd say it looks like. He came back to the table and sat down heavily. If that letter goes to the county sheriff, I'm finished. The ranch goes in the proceedings, there's nothing left for the hands, and there's a man in Blackstone Ridge who lost his farm in that Calloway scheme, and whose wife left, and whose kid died that winter of fever, and the letter would look to everyone like I was part of what did that to him. But were you? I carried a message I didn't understand, and I traded it for money to go play cards in town while my brother froze to death, Cole said. What do you want me to call that? A silence that lasted long enough to be real. I want to call it a 22-year-old making a stupid decision, Claire said, but I'm not the one who gets to decide that. No, he said. The law does. She thought about the household ledger, the 3 years of monthly payments, the slow, deliberate arithmetic of a man paying for a mistake he'd made before he understood the cost of it. She thought about a 9-year-old boy on a cold night on the South Range, and a 22-year-old who hadn't been there. How much do they want? She asked. It's not about the money anymore. It's about compliance. The monthly payment is just, it's a reminder, a demonstration of control. He looked at his hands. What they want is for me to stay quiet and not interfere. If I do that, eventually there won't be enough independent ranches left around here for anyone to organize anyway. And the whole valley becomes theirs. And the hands, Tom and Dutch, and Cyrus? They don't know, he said, any of it. Tom knows something, Claire said. He's too careful around you not to. Cole looked at her. He knows the shape of it, she said. He doesn't know the details. A pause. Maybe. He'd stand with you. I know he would. That's why I haven't told him. His voice was rough. I'm not putting Tom Briggs in front of trouble I made for myself. Clara looked at this man who had paid too much for her at an auction and prepared a wool crate for her daughter and fixed the baking powder problem on a Friday supply run, and who had apparently been eating a slow disaster for 3 years rather than ask his own foreman to help him carry it. She thought about what she'd said to him that first afternoon in the wagon. I'm not going to be grateful in a way that means I don't ask questions or object to things that are wrong. Keeping Tom in the dark isn't protecting him, she said. It's just making sure he can't help you. Cole was quiet for a long time. You've been here 6 days, he said. I know. You don't owe me any of this. No, she said. I don't. I'm saying it because it's true. The lamp between them burned low enough that she could see his face clearly. He looked, for just a moment, like a man who had been braced so long against a weight that he'd forgotten what it felt like not to brace. I'll think about it, he said. It wasn't a promise. But it wasn't a refusal either, and in Clara's experience, a man saying he'd think about something was sometimes the first step toward doing it. The weeks moved. October thinned into November, and the cold arrived in earnest, the kind of cold that gets into the bones of a stone house and has to be fought back with wood and wool and the practical heat of bodies in rooms. Clara learned the house the way she'd learned every place she'd lived, through its needs. The parlor fireplace drew poorly when the wind was from the northwest. The kitchen stove burned best with hardwood, not the split pine that the hands brought in by default. The upstairs hall was colder than it had any right to be because of a gap between the wall and the floor at the north end that she discovered when she watched a candle flame bend sideways for no apparent reason. She fixed what she could fix herself. She reported what she couldn't. Tom Briggs handled most of it without commentary. Nora changed. Clara watched her daughter in the way that mothers watch infants, with the constant, slightly anxious attention of someone who knows that every week is different from the last. At 4 months, Nora had been mostly still. At 5, she became opinionated about things. She decided she did not care for hats. She decided that Tom Briggs, despite his gray beard and his large hands and his general air of weathered severity, was deeply interesting and should be looked at whenever possible. Tom Briggs, for his part, appeared to find this as startling as if he'd been told the barn had grown a second story overnight, but he did not back away from it. Clara caught him one afternoon standing just inside the kitchen door while she was kneading bread, holding his hat in his hands and talking to Nora, who was sitting propped against a folded blanket on the kitchen table. He was telling her about fencing, in detail. Nora was listening with her full attention, which was its own kind of funny. Tom Briggs caught Clara watching him and went red under his beard. Just talking, he said. I can see that, Clara said. She listens. She does. She's very interested in the south pasture fencing situation, apparently. He put his hat back on. She's a good baby, he said gruffly, and went back outside. Clara kept kneading the bread and thought that there were worse things than landing in a house where the foreman talked to your daughter about fencing. Cole was not easy to know. She had expected that from the beginning, and she was not wrong. He was present. She saw him at breakfast, sometimes at supper, occasionally in the evening when he was working on ranch accounts at the table, but he occupied the house lightly, the way a man does who has learned to take up as little space as possible. Not hostile, not cold exactly, just contained, in the way of someone who had decided a long time ago that the best way to not inconvenience anyone was to need very little. But she started to learn the edges of him. He noticed things without saying he noticed them. The first time Nora had a bad night, screaming until 2 a.m. with what Clara was fairly sure was a stomach pain that resolved itself, she'd heard his footsteps stop outside her door in the middle of it, pause for a long moment, and then continue. In the morning, there was extra wood stacked by her room's fireplace, enough to keep the room warm for 3 days. He never mentioned it. He read. She hadn't expected that, not the books themselves, which were there on the shelf and could have been anyone's, but the particular way he read. With a pencil he'd make small marks with in the margins, and the habit of stopping sometimes and looking at a page for a long time without turning it. She found a book on the parlor side table one evening with a passage marked something about the nature of debt and repayment, and she'd read it twice before she decided she'd been meant to see it. She didn't bring it up, but she kept it in mind. The tension between them was not romantic, not exactly, or not only. It was the tension of two careful people in close quarters who had both been damaged in different ways and were both trying to figure out how much the other one could be trusted. Clara had been trusted with Robert's name and his debts and his absence and then his death, and she had learned from that to be slow with her trust even when she wanted to be otherwise. Cole had been trusted with his brother's life and had not been there, and from everything she could see, he had never stopped paying for it in the currency of excessive vigilance and responsibility and keeping other people at a manageable distance. They were, she thought, working on adjacent problems in different rooms. One evening, she came into the parlor to find him sitting by the fire with what she'd come to recognize as the look of a man in the middle of a decision. She almost backed out. "Stay," he said, without turning around. She sat in the chair on the other side of the fireplace. For a while, neither of them said anything. The fire cracked and settled. "I told Tom," he said. Clara was quiet. "This afternoon, after the South Range work." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Not everything. Enough." "How did he take it?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "He was angry," he said. "Not at me exactly, at the situation. He wanted to know why I hadn't told him sooner." A pause. "I didn't have a good answer for that." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I thought I was protecting him." Another pause. Longer. "He told me that was the stupidest thing he'd heard in 30 years of ranch work, and then he told me what he was going to do about it." Clara almost smiled. "What is he going to do about it?" "Talk to Dutch, and Cyrus, and Eli." Cole stopped. "He said it was his ranch too, and he'd been working it for 21 years, and he would appreciate it if I stopped making decisions about what he could and couldn't handle." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He was right," she said. "Yes," Cole said. He was. The fire between them popped and shifted. "You told me," she said, "a few weeks ago, about the Ridgeland Company and the letter and all of it. Why?" He looked at her. "I could have stayed out of it," she said. "If you hadn't told me." "I know." He looked back at the fire. "I told you because you asked, and because you already knew there was something wrong, and lying to you would have been worse than the alternative. Lying to people you respect is harder," she said. A long pause. "Yes," he said quietly. She watched the fire for a moment. "The Ridgeland Company is going to know you've stopped being as cooperative," she said. "Once you've told Tom and the others, once they start looking for options, the company is going to feel it." "I know. Are you ready for that?" He looked at her across the fireplace, and in his face, she could see the things she'd been watching develop for 3 weeks. Not quite resolution, but the territory just next to it. The place a man gets to after he's been deciding something long enough. I think so, he said. Not because I've figured it out. Because I'm tired of being afraid of it. It was an honest answer. She'd come to rely on him for those. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window she'd had Cyrus fix 3 weeks ago. The glass held. The fire burned. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow's a long day. It usually is, he said. She got up and took her lamp and went upstairs, and she heard him banking the fire behind her, and then silence. She lay in the dark and listened to the house and thought about the Ridgeland Company and what a man with a letter and 3 years of leverage would do when that leverage started to slip. She thought about it for a long time, until Nora stirred and she reached over and put her hand on the baby's back and felt the small chest rising and falling, steady and reliable as anything. She thought, something is coming. She thought, when it does, we will not face it alone. She was not certain of that, but she was more certain of it than she'd been of anything since Monday morning 3 weeks ago when she'd folded $43 into a jar of dried beans and picked up a carpet bag and walked out of a house that didn't belong to her anymore. It would have to be enough. The first sign came on a Tuesday, which was the same day Tom Briggs rode back from the Heller place and told Cole that the Hellers were gone. Clara heard it from the kitchen doorway. She wasn't trying to overhear. She'd stepped out to shake a rug, and Tom had ridden in while she was standing on the porch. And he dismounted and gone straight to Cole in the yard without looking at her, which told her before he opened his mouth that whatever he was carrying was not good news. Both of them, Tom said. Packed up. House is empty. Livestock's gone except for 2 horses still in the pasture. They left those, which means they left fast. Cole stood with his arms crossed and his jaw doing the tight thing. When? Sometime in the last 4 days. I rode out because Heller missed the water rights meeting in town Monday, and that's not like him. Did he leave anything? A note? Nothing. Tom pulled his gloves off and knocked them against his thigh. Neighbors 2 miles east say they saw a Ridgeland Company wagon on the Heller Road 3 weeks ago. After that, nothing. A silence. The wind came off the south range cold and direct, the kind of November wind with an opinion about everyone standing in it. That's the 4th this fall, Cole said. 5th, Tom said. Mallory sold in September, remember? We didn't call that one what it was. Cole said nothing. Tom looked at him with the look of a man who has recently been told a great deal and is still working out what it changes. This is what I was missing, he said, while you were being cooperative. The Hellers, the Mallorys, the Prescotts. This is what you were watching happen. Tom, I'm not blaming you right now, Tom said. I'm just naming what it was. He put his gloves back on. We need to talk about what's next. Inside, Cole said. This evening. Tom nodded and led his horse toward the barn, and Cole stood in the yard for a moment longer before he turned and saw Clara on the porch. He didn't look away. She didn't pretend she hadn't heard. I'll put extra coffee on, she said. He gave her one short nod and went inside. What? The meeting that evening was at the kitchen table because the kitchen table was large enough and warm enough, and Hector had gone to bed early with his back, which meant the room was theirs. Clara sat at the far end with the mending she'd been meaning to get to for a week, which was her way of being in the room without claiming the center of it. She had learned when to be present and when to be furniture, and tonight she needed to hear what was said more than she needed to be part of saying it. Cole laid it out plainly. All of it this time. Not the partial version he'd given Tom, but the full architecture. The Ridgeland Company, the letter, the monthly payments, the slow strategy of attrition that had been eating the valley from the outside in for 4 years. Dutch and Cyrus and Eli sat around the table and listened with varying degrees of stillness. Eli's face went through several expressions. Cyrus swore once under his breath and then looked at Clara and apologized, which she waved off. Dutch sat the same way he always sat, and when Cole finished, Dutch said the first full sentence she'd heard him say in 3 weeks. They're going to come for the ranch, Dutch said. Direct, not with lawyers. When? Cole looked at him. You've stopped paying, Dutch said. They'll know. How long before they move on it? They missed last month's payment already, Cole said. I expect we have 2 weeks before they send someone to ask about it. And if we don't have 2 weeks, Clara said. Every face turned toward her end of the table. She set down the mending. The Hellers left fast, she said. That means they were pressured fast. If the Ridge Land Company is accelerating, they may not send someone to ask politely. They may just move. She looked at Cole. What do you know about the men they use when they move past lawyers? A pause. Cole exchanged a look with Tom. 3 regulars, Tom said, taking it up. Braddock boys run the muscle for the company. You've seen them in town. And there's a man named Cord who manages the harder situations. Have you seen Cord recently? In town, 2 weeks back, Eli said. I saw him. I didn't know who he was then. Clara looked at him. What did he look like? Tall, thin, wears a black coat that's too nice for the weather. Dutch nodded once, like this confirmed something he'd already calculated. Then we have less than 2 weeks, Clara said. Probably less than 1. Cole was watching her in the particular way he'd developed over the past weeks. Not with surprise exactly, but with an attentiveness that meant he was taking what she said and putting it somewhere he'd find it later. What makes you say that? A man in a coat that's too nice for the weather is a man who does business elsewhere and only comes to this valley when something specific needs doing, she said. If he was here 2 weeks ago and the Hellers are gone, the timeline connects. The table was quiet. Tom Briggs looked at Cole. She's right, he said. I know she is, Cole said. Whoa. They spent the next 3 hours going over what they had. It was not enough. Clara stayed at the table long after Eli and Cyrus and Dutch went back to the bunkhouse, and she and Cole and Tom worked through the practical arithmetic of the situation until close to midnight. The numbers were not encouraging. 3 ranch hands plus Tom plus Cole against the Braddock brothers, and a man named Cord, and whatever else the Ridgeland Company could bring to bear on a remote ranch in the middle of November, was a sum that didn't work out in Cole Ridge's favor. What they had was the land itself. They knew every foot of it, the draws and the fence lines, the places where the ground dropped away fast, and the places where a man coming from the south would have to cross open ground with nothing to hide behind. Tom had ridden this range for 21 years. Dutch didn't talk, but he'd spent 12 years before Cole Ridge doing things no one asked about, and the way he listened to the tactical conversation told Clara he understood it at a different level than anyone else at the table. We can't hold the house if they come in numbers, Tom said. Not directly. We're not going to try to hold the house, Clara said. Both men looked at her. She'd been thinking about it since the conversation in the yard, building it sideways while she listened to the rest of the discussion. The house is the obvious target, she said. If they want leverage against Cole, against all of us, they take the house, or they try. But if we're not in the house when they come for it, and we're in positions they don't know about, we change the terms. You're talking about a trap, Tom said. I'm talking about not being where they expect us to be. Cole leaned back in his chair and looked at her the way he'd looked at her the first day in the wagon. Not like she was surprising him, but like he was recalibrating something. If they come in numbers, it's still a problem. We'd need to even the numbers first. Then we need help, Clara said. Not the law. Not yet. Not until we have something to give them that's worth acting on. But the ranchers who are still here, the ones who haven't sold or run yet. Tom's expression shifted. There are 4 families inside 10 miles who've been pressured and haven't moved. Would they stand? If they thought there was something to stand for, Tom looked at Cole. If they thought someone wasn't just trying to save his own skin, Cole took that without flinching. Can you reach them? Give me 2 days. You have 1. The day Tom was away, Clara worked. Cole had gone to the South Range with Dutch to check the fence line and look at the draws from the south. The route someone coming to the ranch wouldn't announce themselves on. Cyrus was on the north pasture. Eli was given the task of watching the main road from the ridge above the house, a cold assignment he accepted without complaint because he was that kind of young man. Clara was alone in the house with Nora and Hector. She used the time the way she'd been using every quiet hour since the conversation in the kitchen, building a picture. She walked the house with purpose, not the usual daily movement of maintenance and meals, but the deliberate walk of someone assessing a space for purposes other than living in it. She looked at the windows and their angles. She noted which rooms had 2 exits and which had 1. She found the cellar door in the kitchen floor that she'd known about but not explored, and she went down with a lamp and spent 20 minutes in the cold dark understanding the space. Large enough? solid stone walls, with a narrow external hatch at the far end that opened behind the woodpile. She came back up and stood in the kitchen and looked at the external hatch's location in her mind, plotting it against the outside of the house. "Hector," she said. He looked up from the pot he was stirring. "If something happened here and I needed to get Nora out of the house without going through the front or the back door, could you get her out through that cellar hatch?" Hector looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were sharp and clear in his old face. "See," he said. "Where would I take her?" "The barn, northeast corner behind the feed storage. There's a gap in the boards wide enough to see through, but you can't be seen from the yard." He nodded. "And you?" "I'd be doing something else." He pointed the wooden spoon at her. "You're not as calm as you look," he said in English, which surprised her. She'd been under the impression he had only about 15 words of it. "No," she agreed, "I'm not." He pointed the spoon at her a second time, which seemed to mean something different, more like good, and then turned back to his pot. Tom came back the following evening with news that was better and worse than Clara expected. 3 of the 4 families had agreed to send men. The Calder Ranch could spare 2 hands. The Winslow family would send the eldest son and his brother, and the widow Edna Marsh, who ran 40 head of cattle by herself on the South Fork, and apparently had a reputation that Tom relayed with the combination of admiration and wariness, usually reserved for natural phenomena, had said she'd come herself and bring her ranch foreman. The 4th family, the Talbots, had declined. They'd gotten an offer from the Ridgeland Company that morning, Tom said, and the timing was pointed enough that they all understood what it meant. "They know we're moving," Cole said. "They may know," Tom said. "Or the Talbots moving scared them into accelerating, either way." "Either way," Cole agreed. "We have less time than we thought." Clara was at the table. Nora was asleep upstairs, and she felt the distance between herself and the baby as a specific physical thing, a pull, the way a rope feels when there's weight at the end of it. She put it in the back of her mind and kept it there. "Tell me about Cord," she said. "What's his pattern?" Tom and Cole exchanged the look that had started to annoy her slightly. Not because it was dismissive, but because it preceded information she should have had earlier. "He comes in first," Tom said. "Alone or with one other man, makes the final offer. It's always framed as a conversation." Tom's voice went dry. "The Braddocks follow about 2 hours later if the conversation doesn't go the way Cord wants." "So there's a gap," Clara said. "If it plays out that way, then that's what we plan for." She looked at Cole. "Cord comes and you talk to him. You buy time. Whatever he wants to hear, you give it to him in enough measure that he leaves thinking he has a day or 2 more. That buys us the gap before the Braddocks arrive." "And if he doesn't leave," Cole said, "then the plan changes and we respond to what's in front of us." She kept her voice level. "But men like Cord don't do violence themselves. They manage it. He'll leave." Dutch spoke from the corner where he'd been sitting silent. "What are you planning to do in that gap?" Clara looked at him. "Set the terms," she said. "Before the Braddocks get here, before anything gets violent, we have every man they don't know about in positions they haven't planned for. If Cord reports back that this is one man on an isolated ranch, and what they ride into is something different, they stop, possibly. Or they reassess." "Possibly," Cole repeated. "I don't have certainties," she said. "I have arithmetic. 3 Braddocks against 7 men in positions they don't know about is better arithmetic than 3 Braddocks against Cole and Tom." A silence. 8, said Edna Marsh's voice from the kitchen doorway. Every head turned. The widow Marsh had apparently arrived while they were talking and let herself in through the back, which said something about her. She was somewhere in her 50s, stout and weathered, with short gray hair and the permanent squint of someone who has spent most of their life looking at outdoor distances. She carried a Winchester rifle with the ease of a woman who had been carrying rifles for decades and no longer thought about it. "I said I'd come myself," she told Tom. "I came myself." She looked at Clara. "You're the woman from the auction." "Yes, I heard about that." Edna Marsh looked her up and down with the frank assessment of someone who does not have time for social niceties. "You're the one planning this?" "I'm one of the ones." "Good." Edna pulled out a chair and sat down at the table like she'd been sitting at this table her whole life. "The Braddocks. Which one is the problem?" "The middle one," Tom said. "Vance." "I know Vance Braddock," Edna said flatly. He's not as smart as he thinks he is, but he's mean enough that it almost doesn't matter. You need to take him out of the equation first." "Take him out how?" Cyrus said, with the expression of someone hoping the answer is not what it might be. "Not like that," Edna said, giving Cyrus the brief, withering look that the question deserved. "You separate him from the others before anything starts. Get him isolated. A man who thinks he's the smart one gets very stupid when he's alone, and the situation isn't what he planned for." Clara was looking at Edna Marsh with something she was only partly trying to hide, which was the particular recognition of someone watching another person think the way she thought. "The south draw," Clara said. "If Vance is the one who rides ahead of the others to check the approach—" "He always does," Tom said. "Then the south draw," Clara said. "Two men in the rocks above it. He rides into it, they close the exit. He's off the board without a shot fired." Edna looked at the table. "That would work," she said. "Who do you put in the rocks?" "Dutch," Cole said immediately. Dutch from the corner gave his single nod. "And I'll go with him," Edna said, with a tone that indicated this was not a suggestion. Dutch looked at Edna Marsh for a moment. Something passed between them that Clara couldn't entirely read, but whatever it was, Dutch seemed to find it satisfactory. "Fine," he said. Cole rode out the next morning before dawn to check the south draw himself and confirm the positions, and Clara used the hour before the house woke fully to do something she'd been putting off for 2 days. She wrote a letter, not to anyone at Cole Ridge, and not about the Ridgeland Company's operations. That would come later, if things went right. This was a different letter, practical and specific, addressed to a territorial land attorney she'd found the name of in the back of the household account ledger, where Cole had apparently noted it years ago and never acted on. She wrote clearly and without emotional language about the nature of the Ridgeland Company's acquisition tactics, the timeline of the pressured sales in the valley, the structure of the monthly payments, and the existence of a document being used as leverage. She did not mention Cole's name. She mentioned the letter obliquely, evidence being used under duress to enforce compliance, and she asked what the legal options were for a rancher who had been coerced and whether documents obtained for purposes of blackmail were admissible in county court. She sealed it and addressed it and put it in her coat pocket. When Eli went to town for supplies later that day, she gave it to him along with the supply list. "This goes in the post," she said. "Not to Garrett Voss, not to anyone in the store. Directly to the post." Eli looked at the address. Back at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said, with the expression of someone who understands more than he's being told and has made a decision to just do the thing. She watched him ride out and thought, if we don't get the chance to use the answer, it doesn't matter. But if we do get the chance, we'll need it in writing. They had 2 more days. The Calder hands arrived Thursday morning. 2 brothers named Pete and Samuel, quiet and capable, with the look of men who had been waiting for someone to organize something and were relieved to have been called. The Winslow boys came that afternoon, and Clara fed everyone from a pot of beans and salt pork that Hector had started at daybreak, because whatever else was happening, men who hadn't eaten don't think clearly. She also slept badly. She would have been lying to herself if she'd claimed otherwise. The nights were the worst part, the quiet time when there was nothing to organize and plan and keep moving, and the stillness let in the things she'd been keeping out with activity. She lay in the dark and listened to Nora breathe and thought about what could go wrong, which was a long list, and then she made herself go through the plan again from the beginning, which helped. Not because it made things certain, but because it gave her mind something to hold on to. On the second night, sometime around 2 in the morning, she heard footsteps in the hallway, and then a pause outside her door. Cole's footsteps. She knew them by now. "I'm awake," she said. A silence. Then, "I know. I could tell. Could you?" No light under the door. When you're working, there's always a light. A pause. When you're just lying there awake, there isn't. She thought about that. "You've been paying attention." "I've been paying attention," he said. Through the door, his voice was quieter than usual, and she could hear in it the same thing she felt, the specific texture of a night that won't let you sleep. "Are you all right?" she asked. A long pause. "I'm thinking about the Hellers," he said, "and the Mallorys, and the Prescotts." He stopped. "I've been watching the Valley contract for 3 years and telling myself it wasn't my fault because I didn't have a choice. The letter, Dawson." She had not called him by his first name before. She heard the small shift it made in the air. Go to sleep. We need you present tomorrow and the day after. A silence. You called me Dawson, he said. Don't make anything of it. Another pause, and she thought she heard the faint sound of something that might have been the beginning of a real laugh, quickly subdued. Yes, ma'am, he said, with a cadence that was almost light. His footsteps moved back down the hall. Clara stared at the ceiling and thought about that cadence for a while, and then firmly moved on to other things. Cord arrived on a Friday. He came alone, which meant he was confident, and he came on a good horse, which meant he wanted to be seen as someone who could afford one. He was exactly as Eli had described, tall, thin, and wearing a coat that was made for a city office rather than a November ranch yard. He had a long, pale face with the particular blankness of a man who had learned to make his expressions a professional tool. Cole met him in the yard. Clara watched from the kitchen window. She had positioned herself there specifically because Cord would not know that the woman in the kitchen window existed, or matter if he did, and because from the kitchen window she could see the road south to the draw, and if she looked hard enough she could see the edge of the ridge where Eli was keeping watch. Nothing moved on the ridge. That was the signal for nothing yet. Cord dismounted, shook hands. Clara watched his body language, practiced, comfortable, the posture of a man who does this regularly and has never lost. Cole's body language was different from usual, more closed, more careful. She knew him well enough now to recognize the difference between natural stillness and the deliberate stillness of someone managing themselves very precisely. They talked for 20 minutes. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she watched the shape of it. Cord speaking at length with occasional gestures, Cole listening and responding briefly, the rhythm of a conversation that one party thinks they're controlling. At one point, Cole shook his head, and Cord's hands opened in the gesture of a reasonable man who is simply trying to help. At another point, Cole said something that made Cord go still briefly before resuming. Tom was in the barn. Dutch and Edna Marsh had been in the South Draw since before dawn. Pete and Samuel Calder were in the rocks above the north fence line. The Winslow boys were in the far tree line to the east. Cyrus was with Nora and Hector in the cellar. Cord got back on his horse. He said something to Cole, one short sentence, delivered with the flat finality of a closing argument. Cole looked up at him and said something back, equally short. Cord turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Cole walked to the kitchen. "How long do we have?" Clara said before he was through the door. He said he'd need to make some arrangements. Cole's face was the face of someone who has just had an unpleasant conversation and is processing the residue of it. 2 hours, he said, maybe 3. He was confident. Did he believe you'd consider the offer? He believed I was tired of fighting. Cole stopped. He's not wrong about that. But he doesn't know why I'm tired. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Eli. Cole turned. Eli was already at the door. He'd come down from the ridge at a run when Cord left the yard, and he was out of breath, his face red from the cold. Rider on the south road, Eli said. One man. He met Cord halfway, turned around, and rode back fast. Already? Clara said. They were closer than we thought, Cole said. How long? 40 minutes, Eli said. Maybe less. Clara looked at the window, at the road, at the position of the sun. Go tell Tom, she said to Eli. Tell Dutch they're moving faster. To Cole, you need to be visible in the yard when they come, alone. One man, no weapons showing, no sign we have anyone else. If they see what we have, they don't stop in the draw. They just come in hard. And you? I'll be in the house. I need to be in the house. She held his eyes for a second. Go. He went. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed. The fire was burning, the coffee was on, and the room looked exactly like the kitchen of a ranch house at mid-morning with a woman managing it. She thought about Nora in the cellar, and Hector's hand on the baby's back and the narrow external hatch behind the woodpile. She thought, I will not be a person that things happen to. She had been that person, on a Monday morning with deputies on her porch and a carpet bag in her hand, on an auction platform in a bruised sky square with 200 people watching. She had been that person as long as she'd had to be, and it had been necessary, and she had survived it. But she was done with surviving by staying still. She went to the kitchen shelf and took down the small jar she'd moved from her carpet bag to the pantry the first week. The $43 were still inside, which she'd always considered more insurance than money. Behind the jar, in the back of the shelf, where it had been since she found it 3 weeks ago during a deep clean of the pantry, was an old Navy Colt revolver wrapped in an oilskin cloth. She'd cleaned it on a Tuesday when the house was quiet and hadn't told anyone she'd done it. She took it down from the shelf, checked the cylinder with the practiced hand of a woman who had grown up on a working farm with practical parents, and put it in her coat pocket. Then she went to the window and watched the South Road and waited for the Braddock brothers to ride into the plan she'd helped build for them. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, the ranch sat in the thin November sun looking empty and quiet, which was exactly what it was supposed to look like. Clara kept her hand in her coat pocket and her eyes on the road, and she breathed slowly, and she waited. They came in from the South Road at a pace that said they weren't expecting resistance. Clara counted them from the kitchen window as they cleared the tree line. 2 riders, not 3, which meant the draw had worked. Vance Braddock was off the board. The 2 that remained were the older brother, Ray, and the youngest, whose name Tom had said was Denny, and who was 22 years old and had been riding with his brothers since he was 15, because that was the family business. Ray rode in front. Denny was slightly behind and to the right, the way men ride when one of them is the decision and the other is the backup. Cole was in the yard, standing near the water trough with his arms at his sides. He looked like a man who had been expecting visitors and was not happy about it, which was accurate and also exactly the impression that needed to be made. Clara watched Ray Braddock pull up his horse 20 feet from Cole and take a slow, practiced look around the yard. She recognized the look. It was the look of a man assessing whether the space in front of him matches the space he was told about. She held herself still at the window, back far enough from the glass that she'd be hard to see from outside, and watched him look. He looked at the barn, the bunkhouse, the house, the yard. He didn't look long enough at any of it. That was the thing about men who came in confident. They saw what they expected to see and moved through the assessment too fast. "Cole," Ray said. "Braddock." Cole's voice carried to the window without effort. "Cord said I had 2 hours." "Cord says a lot of things." Ray dismounted in the easy way of a man who's done this before and knows how it usually goes. "We had some spare time." "Where's Vance?" A slight pause. Ray looked at Denny. Denny shrugged with the expression of genuine uncertainty, which told Clara that the draw had worked better than they'd hoped. Vance hadn't been in communication with his brothers since they split up. "He'll be along," Ray said, and there was a small visible recalculation in his posture that he didn't entirely manage to hide. He was missing a piece of his plan and adjusting, and men who are adjusting make different decisions than men who are certain. "What can I do for you?" Cole said. It was not a question. "You can take the offer," Ray said. "Same number Cord put on the table, fair market, maybe a little better. You sign the papers and Cole Ridge transfers clean, and nobody needs to make things complicated." "I'm not signing anything." Ray looked at him for a moment. Then he smiled, which was the kind of smile that had nothing to do with being happy. "Mr. Cole, you understand the situation you're in." "I understand it fine." "Then you understand that the letter your friend Calloway left behind is going to make you a very unpopular man in Blackstone Ridge, once it circulates." Ray's voice was reasonable, measured, the voice of someone who has given this speech before and found it effective. 3 families lost everything in that scheme. People remember. The county sheriff may be slow about some things, but when there's a named document with a signature on it, "Ray," the voice came from behind him. Ray Braddock turned around. Tom Briggs was standing at the corner of the barn with a rifle. Pete Calder was at the bunkhouse door. Samuel was by the fence. The Winslow boys were visible at the tree line to the east, and Edna Marsh had come up from the south draw and was standing at the entrance to the yard with her Winchester and an expression of comprehensive impatience. Denny's hand moved toward his hip. "Don't," Dutch said. Dutch had come around the back of the house at some point in the last 2 minutes without Clara seeing or hearing him, which she found both impressive and slightly unsettling. He was 4 feet behind Denny, with a rifle at his shoulder, and the flat, unbothered look of a man who has been in this kind of moment before and found it less exciting than other people did. Denny's hand stopped. Ray Braddock stood in the middle of the yard and looked at the circle of people around him and did the same arithmetic Clara had done, except from the other side of it. His face went through several things and settled into something hard and still. the expression of a man who has lost the hand and is deciding how to sit with it. "You put this together," he said to Cole. "I had help," Cole said. Ray looked around the yard again. Slower this time, more careful, the look he should have given it 5 minutes ago. His eyes landed on the kitchen window briefly and moved away, and then came back. Clara stepped back from the glass. "How many are there?" Ray said. "Enough," Cole said. A silence. The November wind moved through the yard and no one said anything. "Where's my brother?" Ray said, and for just a moment the professional flatness in his voice cracked, and something real was underneath it. Not fear, but close to it. The thing that happens when a plan fails, and the people in it start having personal dimensions. "He's in the south draw," Tom said. "He's not hurt. He's sitting down and thinking about his choices, which is something he should have done considerably earlier." Ray looked at Tom, then at Cole. "This doesn't end here," he said. "You understand that. The letter, Cole said, is leverage. And leverage only works if the person being leveraged is afraid of it." He paused. "I'm done being afraid of it. You'll lose everything. Maybe. Or maybe the county attorney will be more interested in a land company running a 4-year coercion campaign across the whole valley than in a 22-year-old mistake made by a man who didn't know what he was carrying." Cole's voice was steady. Not loud, not aggressive. Steady in the way of something that has been decided rather than performed. "I've had 3 weeks to think about that calculation, and I think I've been wrong about it for a long time." Ray Braddock looked at him for a long moment. "Put your weapons down," Cole said. "Both of you. We're going to do this properly." The Braddock brothers were confined to the bunkhouse under the watch of Pete and Samuel Calder, who had no personal stake in whether the Braddocks were comfortable and showed it. Edna Marsh went back to the south draw to escort Vance up to the ranch, and Clara heard the sound of that reunion from the kitchen where she was making coffee. Raised voices, some profanity, and then silence, which probably meant Edna had said something that ended the discussion. Vance came into the yard with his hands bound and his expression the particular blank fury of a man who has been outsmarted and is not going to admit it. He was the biggest of the three, heavy through the chest, with a flat and somewhat unintelligent face that was doing its best to project menace under the current circumstances. Dutch took charge of him with a hand on his arm and walked him to the bunkhouse without apparent effort, and Vance went because the arithmetic still applied. Clara put coffee on the table and sat down. Cole came inside. Tom was behind him. Edna Marsh came in last, knocked the mud off her boots on the porch, and accepted a cup of coffee with the air of a woman who has accomplished a task and is ready to discuss the next one. "What now?" Tom said. "We sent for the sheriff," Cole said. Tom looked skeptical. "Grady Polk? He's in the company's pocket up to his elbows. You know that." "Not Polk," Clara said. "The territorial marshal." Every face at the table turned toward her. She'd been waiting for this moment since the letter she'd written 3 days ago, which she'd said nothing about yet because saying something before the plan worked would have been a way of owning the outcome before she knew what it was. 3 days ago, I wrote to a territorial land attorney named Harlow, whose name is in the back of your account ledger, she said to Cole. I laid out the structure of what Ridge Land Company has been doing. The coercions, the timeline, the nature of the instrument they've been using for leverage, without naming names. I asked about the legal standing of a rancher who'd been operating under duress. She looked at him steadily. I expect his response within a week, but I don't think we should wait for the response. I think we send for the marshal today with the Braddock brothers in the bunkhouse, and we tell everything. Cole was looking at her with the expression she recognized from the kitchen window, the careful, considering attention. If we go to the marshal, the letter comes out. Yes, she said. It comes out in context, not the way Ridge Land Company would have released it, as a standalone document designed to destroy you, but as one piece of a coercion scheme that goes back 4 years and involves documented pressure against a dozen families in this valley. She held his gaze. That context is different. It's not nothing, what you did at 22. I'm not saying it is, but the law has some interest in proportionality, and a man who carried one message without knowing what it was is a different case than a man who ran the scheme. You've been thinking about this for a while, Tom said. Since the first night I looked at the ledger and found the Ridge Company fee, Clara said. Tom looked at Cole. Cole was still looking at Clara. I should have told you sooner, she said, about the letter to the attorney. I didn't know if the plan would work, and I didn't want to hand you something else to carry if it didn't. Cole was quiet for a moment. You were protecting me, he said. I was being practical, she said. There's a difference. The corner of his mouth moved. It was slight enough that she might have imagined it, except that Tom also appeared to notice, and looked quickly at his coffee. All right, Cole said. We send for the marshal. It took 3 days. 3 days of the Braddock brothers in the bunkhouse, which was nobody's favorite arrangement, and 3 days of the neighboring men staying on, which was harder on everyone's nerves than the confrontation had been. Men who had been mobilized for a crisis and found themselves waiting for paperwork had a way of becoming difficult to manage, and Clara spent a not insignificant amount of that time feeding people and keeping conversations from becoming arguments. Edna Marsh stayed. She had declared herself useful and proceeded to be so, in her blunt, comprehensive way. She and Clara developed a working understanding within about 24 hours. Edna didn't soften things she thought needed saying, and Clara didn't pretend to be less capable than she was. And between those two accommodations, they found a functional partnership. On the second morning, Edna found Clara in the kitchen at 5:30 and sat down with her coffee and said, without preamble, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "A woman rescued." Edna said it plainly. "That's what people were saying. Woman from the auction Cole brought home. Charity case." "People in Blackstone Ridge have limited information," Clara said. "They do." Edna looked at her. "You planned most of this. Cole and Tom and Dutch had been planning parts of it before I was involved." "Don't diminish it," Edna said. "I'm not praising you to be polite. I'm saying you planned most of this and it worked, and you should know that clearly without decorating it with qualifications." She drank her coffee. "Women out here learn early to not take credit for things, because it makes men nervous. I'm telling you, take the credit." Clara looked at this woman who ran 40 head of cattle alone on the South Fork and had shown up with a Winchester and taken a position in the South Draw without being asked. "How long have you been on your own?" she asked. "My husband died in '81, Edna said. 12 years. "Was it hard?" Edna gave her the long look that the question deserved. "Yes," she said, "and no. The hard part isn't the work. The hard part is other people's certainty that you can't do it." She set down her cup. "Which you seem to have figured out for yourself." They sat in the kitchen quiet for a while, and it was, Clara thought, one of the most genuinely comfortable silences she'd experienced since arriving at Cole Ridge. Marshal Aaron Deeds rode in on the third day with a deputy and the air of a man who had been doing this job long enough to have stopped being surprised by things. He was in his 50s, compact and undemonstrative, with a gray mustache and steady eyes that took in the ranch yard and the bunkhouse and the assembled people with the same expression he probably wore reading his morning mail. Cole met him on the porch. Clara stayed inside but left the kitchen door open because she was done pretending she was not part of this. Cole talked for a long time. The marshal listened without interrupting, which Clara had already decided she respected. When Cole finished, Deeds asked 3 questions. Specific, precise questions about dates and the nature of the documents and the names of the families who'd been pressured, and wrote the answers in a small notebook. Then he asked to see the Braddocks. That interview lasted 40 minutes. Clara couldn't hear it, but she watched the barn through the kitchen window and tracked the marshal's body language on the way in and on the way out. On the way in, professional neutrality. On the way out, something that had sharpened. He came to the kitchen. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. Tom had evidently told him who she was. "I understand you have some documentation regarding the payment history." 3 years of household ledger entries, she said, cross-referenced against the ranch accounts where I could find them, and a letter I sent to a territorial attorney 3 days ago that summarizes the broader pattern, which you're welcome to a copy of. Deeds looked at her with the evaluating attention of a professional. "You sent that letter before any of this happened?" "Before the confrontation in the yard, yes. I wanted a legal opinion on the standing of a coerced party before we moved." A pause. "That was careful thinking," he said. "I was trying to be useful," she said. He sat down at the kitchen table and she put the ledger in front of him, open to the first Ridge Company fee entry, and spent 40 minutes walking him through what she'd found and how she'd cross-referenced it and what pattern emerged. The marshal asked questions and wrote things down, and at one point looked up at her with the expression of someone recalibrating an expectation. "You said you've been at Coal Ridge for how long?" he said. 6 weeks, she said. He looked at the ledger. "This is 6 weeks of work?" "I had time," she said. The Braddock brothers were taken to Blackstone Ridge in custody that afternoon, which Clara watched from the porch with Nora on her hip. The brothers went without the violence that might have been expected, because they had done the arithmetic and found it unfavorable, and because Vance Braddock had apparently said something to Ray during the 3 days in the bunkhouse that had produced a significant argument, and then a long quiet, and Ray had come out of it looking like a man who was reconsidering his position. She didn't know what Vance had said. She didn't ask. What she found out later, from Deeds, through Tom, through the chain of information that moves through small frontier communities faster than any official communication, was that Vance Braddock, in the custody interview, had provided more information than anyone expected. Not from conscience and not from strategy, but from the specific bitterness of a man who has realized he has been used by people who considered him disposable. The Ridgeland Company had been promising the Braddocks a share of the acquisitions for 3 years and had delivered almost nothing. Cord had been skimming from payments before they reached the brothers. There were records, Vance had records, kept out of self-protection, that documented the full 4-year operation in more detail than Clara's ledger analysis, and more detail than any individual family's testimony could have provided. Vance Braddock was not a good man, but he was an angry one, which in this instance was the same thing as a useful one. Cole came to find her late that evening after the neighboring men had finally started the process of going home and the ranch had begun returning to something like its ordinary dimensions. He found her at the kitchen table where she seemed to spend most of her time, with the mending she still hadn't gotten through and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He sat down across from her. She waited. "The marshal told me what you gave him," he said. "The ledger analysis. The letter." "Yes. You had that ready." "I had been preparing it," she said. "I didn't know when it would be needed." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. "You've been managing things I didn't ask you to manage," he said. Clara looked at him. "Are you objecting to that?" A pause. "No," he said. "I'm trying to figure out what it means." "It means I saw a problem and I worked on it," she said. "That's what I do. You hired me to manage the house accounts. The accounts had a problem. The problem was larger than the accounts." "You could have told me." "I was telling you," she said. "I told you about the Ridge Company fee the first week. I told you Voss knew something. I told you Tom should know." She kept her voice level. "You weren't ready for all of it at once. I gave it to you in the pieces you could act on." He looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight, his face was the face of a man who is working through something difficult and is not trying to hide that he is. "You've been carrying it," he said. "I've been doing my job," she said. "Clara." She stopped. He didn't say it loudly. He said it the way she'd said Dawson 2 nights ago. Not a deliberate choice, more like a word that came out at the level that things are real. And like that night, it changed the temperature of the air between them in a way that was small and specific and not nothing. "You've been carrying it," he said again, "since before the plan, since the ledger. You knew something was wrong from the first week and you started working on it quietly because... Why? Because you didn't want to put more on me?" "Partly," she said honestly, "and partly because I wasn't sure yet what the picture was, and partly because it was mine to work on. You can't hand someone a problem and not let them do anything with it." "I hired you to manage the house," he said. "I didn't hire you to hold up the whole enterprise." "No," she agreed. "You didn't. I did that because I wanted to." She looked at him directly. "Because it mattered. Because this place matters, and the people in it matter, and I wasn't going to watch it go the way the Heller place went if I could do anything about it." A silence. "6 weeks ago, you were on an auction platform," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was more like someone saying something aloud that they've been turning over for a while. "I know where I was 6 weeks ago," she said. "I'm saying..." He stopped. Started again. "When I went to that auction, I had a plan that I thought was simple. I needed someone in the house who wouldn't panic, someone with a reason to stay. I was thinking about the ranch. I was thinking about the practical problem. He looked at his hands. I wasn't thinking about you, the person. I didn't. I wasn't thinking about what it meant for someone to stand on that platform. Clara was quiet. I've been thinking about it since, he said, what it cost you, and what you've done with it since you got here. He looked up. I want you to know that I see it, what you've done here. Not just this week, all of it. She looked at this man who had fixed a broken window before she arrived and built a wool crate for her daughter and told her the truth about hard things when she asked for it, and who had just said the most careful, honest thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. I know you see it, she said. I want to make sure you know. Dawson. She said it deliberately this time. I know. The lamp between them burned. Somewhere upstairs, Nora made the small sound she made when she was moving from one kind of sleep to another, settling deeper. Both of them heard it, and neither of them moved, and the fact of that, two people in a kitchen at night both listening for the same child, settled something between them that hadn't had a name yet. The response from the territorial attorney arrived 8 days later. It was longer and more specific than Clara had expected, which told her that Harlow had taken the question seriously. He laid out the legal distinctions she'd asked about with careful precision. The difference between willing participation in fraud and coerced complicity, the weight courts gave to the duration and nature of the duress, and the extent to which a document obtained through coercion could be used as evidence versus submitted as part of the coercion case itself. The short version was that Cole's position was considerably stronger than he'd believed for 3 years. Not clean, not without complication, but defensible. Substantially defensible, if the full context was presented. She read it twice at the kitchen table before she brought it to Cole. He was in the barn with Tom when she found him, and she handed it to him without saying anything and went back to the house and gave him time. He came inside an hour later. He says I should have gone to the law 3 years ago, Cole said. He says you have a viable defense if you're transparent with the marshal about the full context, Clara said, which you've already been. It's not the same as being innocent. No, she said, it isn't, but it's the truth, which is what you have to work with. He stood in the kitchen with the letter and looked at it, and she watched him accept something that had been held at arm's length for a long time. Not forgiveness exactly, because that wasn't hers or the attorney's to give, but the more practical thing, the possibility of a future that wasn't organized around a secret. The marshal wants to meet again next week, Cole said, with the full account. I know, he sent a note. Will you come? She looked at him. You want me there? I want you there, he said simply. It was not a request for backup. It was something different. The particular request of a man who has decided he doesn't want to do something alone when he doesn't have to. All right, she said, I'll come. He nodded. Then, after a moment, in the same carefully considered way he did most things, he said, Tom wants to know if you're staying. Clara looked at him. Tom wants to know? Cole held her gaze. Tom wants to know, he said steadily, and so do I. She thought about the auction platform, and the carpet bag, and the $43 and a wool crate lined with folded blankets. She thought about Edna Marsh saying, take the credit, and Tom Briggs talking to her daughter about fencing. She thought about what it meant to build something in a place that needed building. My contract is for a year, she said. I know what the contract says. A year is a long time. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at him for a moment. Ask me again at the end of the year, she said. When we know what the territory looks like, when we know how the marshal's case goes, when things are... She stopped. When things are clearer. He nodded. It was not disappointment, or not only. It was also the look of a man who understands that some things can't be rushed and has learned, the hard way, that patience is not the same as giving up. That's fair, he said. She turned back to the stove. Supper in an hour, she said. I know, he said. And she heard in his voice that he did know. Not just the fact of supper in an hour, but all of it. The table and the lamp and the hour before the hands came in and the shape of a day that had become, in 6 weeks and against every expectation, something she recognized as hers. She kept her back to him so he wouldn't see her face, and she heard him walk back out to the barn, and she stood at the stove and let the warmth of the kitchen settle around her and thought about a year. A year was a long time. Long enough for things to become clear. Long enough for a person to know what they were deciding when they decided. She picked up the wooden spoon and started on supper and let herself, carefully and only a little, think about what the answer might be. The meeting with Marshal Deeds happened on a Thursday in the back room of the Territorial Land Office in Blackstone Ridge, which was a small and poorly heated room with a single window that looked out onto the alley behind the hardware store. Clara had been in this town as a person being auctioned, and now she was in it as a witness. And the difference between those two versions of herself, separated by 6 weeks, was large enough that she felt it physically as she walked through the door. Deeds had a court reporter with him, a young man with ink-stained fingers who wrote with the rapid, slightly desperate efficiency of someone who had trained for this and was now confronted with a situation more complicated than the training. He wrote everything. Cole sat across the table from the marshal and told the full account from the beginning, not the shaped version, not the version that left out the embarrassing parts, but the actual sequence of events as they had happened in 1871 and in every year since. Clara sat to his left. She had not been asked to say anything yet, but she had brought the ledger and the attorney's letter and her own analysis in a leather folder she'd found in the study, and they were on the table in front of her, organized in the order she expected they'd be needed. Cole talked for a long time. He talked about Calloway, and the message, and the money, and his brother's death, and the years of paying Ridgeland Company because he had believed the letter was an ending he couldn't survive. He talked about it plainly, without the particular kind of self-pity that turns a confession into a performance, and without the other kind of deflection that turns it into a resume of extenuating circumstances. He talked about it the way a man talks when he has decided that the truth is simply the most practical available option. Deeds listened, the reporter wrote. When Cole finished, Deeds asked his questions, and then he looked at Clara, and she walked him through the ledger analysis for the second time. The payment history, the cross-references, the pattern of dates that corresponded to moments when Cole Ridge should have pushed back on Ridgeland Company expansion and hadn't. She had thought about this presentation carefully, and she'd thought about what it meant to lay out a man's private failure as documentary evidence in front of a law officer, and she'd decided that the way to do it was exactly the same way Cole had done his testimony, plainly, without decoration, with the understanding that the facts were the facts, and they were also context, and both things were true at the same time. Deeds looked at her analysis for a long time. "You put this together in 6 weeks," he said. It was the second time he'd said that. It seemed to keep surprising him. "I had access to the records," she said. "The pattern was in the records. I just read them carefully. Most people don't. Most people aren't looking for it," she said. The territorial case against the Ridgeland Company took 4 months to build and another 2 to bring to hearing, which was faster than anyone had expected and slower than the winter made comfortable. The valley was cold, and the uncertainty was colder. And there were weeks during those months when Clara lay awake at night running scenarios and outcomes the way she'd run the supply lists and the ledger entries, carefully, methodically, trying to account for every variable. What she could not account for was whether a territorial court would look at the letter Calloway had left behind and decide that context was sufficient, or whether it would look at a name and a signature and decide that was sufficient instead. That was the variable that couldn't be controlled, and it was the one that mattered most. Cole knew this. He didn't talk about it constantly, which she respected, but she could see it in him, in the way he was slightly more careful than usual, slightly more deliberate, as though he was trying to make himself small enough that whatever came would have less to strike. She watched him do this and said nothing until one evening in January when she found him at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, not reading, not working, just sitting with his hands around a cold cup of coffee and his eyes on the middle distance. She sat down across from him. "It won't help," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever you're doing right now," she said, "trying to prepare for the worst, it won't help. You'll be just as unprepared when it comes, and you'll have spent the intervening time in a state of dread for no useful reason." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not very comforting," he said. "I know, but it's true." She looked at him. "The case is what it is. Harlow is good at his job. The marshal is thorough. You told the truth, and you gave them everything." She paused. "What happens next is not something you can manage from this kitchen at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday." He looked at his cold coffee. "You're telling me to go to sleep." I'm telling you to go to sleep. A silence. Then, unexpectedly, a sound that was genuinely a laugh. Brief and rough, like something that hadn't been used in a while and found the air unfamiliar. You are the most practical person I have ever met in my life, he said. I'll take that as a compliment, she said. It was one. He pushed back from the table. Good night, Clara. Good night. She sat alone in the kitchen after he went upstairs and drank his leftover cold coffee, and thought about how different that conversation was from every conversation she'd had in the kitchen at Cutter Creek, in the house that hadn't been hers either, with a man who'd mortgaged everything he owned and not told her. She thought about the particular difference between being with someone and being adjacent to them, and how long she'd accepted adjacency as the available version of not being alone. She thought about a year and how much of it was already gone. Nora learned to pull herself upright in February, using the kitchen table leg as a fulcrum, and stood there holding on with both fists with the expression of someone who has solved a significant problem and is waiting for appropriate recognition. Clara picked her up and kissed her forehead and told her she was remarkable, and Nora patted Clara's cheek with an open hand in the distracted way of someone who has already moved on to thinking about the next problem. Tom Briggs witnessed this from the kitchen doorway and made a sound that Clara was fairly certain was him trying not to say anything sentimental. She's going to be walking by March, he said. She's going to be walking in 2 weeks at this rate, Clara said. Tom looked at Nora with the particular expression he always wore around her. The soft, gruff, slightly bewildered expression of a man who had not planned to become attached to an infant and found himself in that position anyway. She looks like you, he said. Around the eyes. Clara looked at her daughter's face. Nora had Robert's coloring, the same dark hair, the same broad forehead. But Tom was right about the eyes, wide-set and direct and already accustomed to looking at things straight on. She'll be all right, Tom said. Whatever happens. She'll be all right here. He said it simply, the way he said things that mattered to him. Straight, no performance around it. Clara looked at him and thought about what it meant that this gray-bearded man with 21 years on this ranch had just told her, without any particular drama, that her daughter had a place here. Thank you, Tom, she said. He nodded once, put his hat on, and went back outside. The hearing was in March. It lasted 3 days, which was 2 days longer than Harlow had originally estimated, and 1 day shorter than Clara had feared. She was not present for all of it. Her testimony had been given in written form, through deeds, as part of the documentary evidence, which Harlow had arranged deliberately to keep her out of the room where the letter was being discussed. She had not asked why. She understood why. The letter was Cole's to answer for, and adding her presence to the room would not have helped and might have complicated things. She waited. She was not good at waiting. She had established this clearly during the 4 months of preparation, when she had managed the waiting by working, and the waiting was worse when there was nothing left to prepare. She spent the 3 days of the hearing doing the March accounts and reorganizing the barn storage and teaching Nora to clap, which Nora found deeply satisfying and practiced at significant volume for most of the first afternoon. Cole came home on the 3rd evening. Clara heard the wagon on the road before it cleared the tree line and went to the kitchen window. The same window she'd stood at 4 months ago, watching Ray Braddock take his slow, confident survey of the yard. She watched Cole drive in and hand the wagon off to Eli and stand in the yard for a moment with his hands at his sides. She couldn't read him from the window. She went to the door. He came up the porch steps and stopped when he saw her in the doorway. He looked tired in a way that was specific and recent, rather than the deep architectural tiredness she'd been watching ease out of him over the past months. His face was doing something complicated. Well, she said. The company is finished, he said. The principals are facing criminal charges. The acquisition contracts on the pressured properties are under review for invalidation. He stopped. 3 families may get their land back, including the Hellers. She breathed. And the letter? She said. He looked at her. The complicated thing in his face resolved into something she didn't have a precise name for, not relief entirely, not happiness exactly. Something quieter than both and larger than either. The court found that it was obtained under conditions of fraud and used as an instrument of coercion, he said. It goes into the case record as evidence of the coercion scheme, not as evidence against me. He stopped again. Harlow says the language in the ruling is, he said it's about as clear a vindication as I was likely to get, given the circumstances. that it was a mistake I made and not a crime, and that the 10 years of payments I made under duress demonstrate the weight they held over me rather than demonstrating willing participation. Clara looked at him standing on the porch of his own ranch house in the March evening, and she saw in him something she had been watching develop since November, the slow, difficult, imperfect process of a man setting down a weight he had carried so long he'd forgotten it was separate from him. "Come inside," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten." "I haven't," he said. "Not since this morning." "Then come inside." Walk. The valley changed in the months that followed, the way things change when a pressure that has been applied for a long time is suddenly removed. It didn't happen fast. Nothing in frontier country happens fast except disaster. But it happened visibly. The Hellers came back in April. Clara heard about it from Edna Marsh, who rode over on a Wednesday specifically to report it, because Edna had decided at some point during the winter that Clara was someone worth reporting things to and had acted on this decision with characteristic directness. The land invalidation proceedings were slow and legally complicated, which Harlow had warned everyone about, but they moved forward. 2 of the 3 families whose contracts were under review had confirmed their intention to return. The third, the Prescotts, had put down roots elsewhere during their months away and decided not to come back, which was their right, and which Clara thought about sometimes as a reminder that some things, once broken, don't reassemble the same way even when the pieces are returned. Not everything could be undone. The years the Braddocks had worked for Ridge Land Company couldn't be undone. The Calloway scheme and the 3 families it had hurt couldn't be undone. Cole's brother was still dead, and would always be dead, and no amount of legal resolution changed the November night that had made Cole into the careful, self-blaming, over-responsible man she had found 6 months ago paying for someone else's fraud with his neighbor's safety. She thought about that sometimes, about the things that don't get fixed even when the story resolves, about how the resolution of a situation and the healing of a person are 2 different timelines running at different speeds, and confusing them was a way of cheating yourself out of the actual work. Cole was better. Genuinely, measurably better. Lighter in the way of someone no longer maintaining a constant vigilance against exposure, more present at the table, more likely to say what he thought without the half-second delay she'd come to recognize as him running it through a filter first. He laughed occasionally, the real kind, not the controlled almost laugh she'd noticed in the early weeks. He had started leaving the study door open in the evenings, which she had identified as a behavioral shift before she consciously understood what it meant. But he was also still the man who woke in the night sometimes, and lay quiet in a way she could sometimes hear through the wall, and who went to the South Range alone when something was working in him that he hadn't sorted out yet, and who still flinched very slightly when someone mentioned his brother's name. Healing is not linear, and it is not complete. Clara had learned this about herself, and she recognized it in him, and she thought that one of the most honest things a person could do for someone they cared about was to see that clearly and not pretend it was otherwise. The year she had asked for ended on a Thursday in October, which was the 1-year anniversary of the auction, though neither of them had mentioned this directly. She knew that he knew. She could tell by the way the day had a different quality to it than ordinary days, not charged exactly, but careful, both of them moving through the ordinary work of the ranch with a slight excess of attention, the way people move when they are aware of something they are not yet discussing. Supper that evening was the 2 of them, because Tom had taken Cyrus and Dutch and Eli to look at a fence situation on the South Range that Clara was fairly certain did not require 4 people, but had apparently required all 4 of them to go together after supper, which was either a coincidence or a kindness, and she suspected the latter. Nora was in bed. Hector had gone to his room at 7:30 with a pointed lack of curiosity about what Clara and Cole were going to do with the evening, which was, in its own way, Hector's form of blessing. She cleared the supper dishes. He poured coffee. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table where they had sat across from each other dozens of times in the past year, in the lamplight that had become a familiar kind of warmth. 1 year, he said. 1 year, she agreed. A silence. The fire in the stove ticked. You could leave, he said. The contract is complete. The reward money from the Ridge Land Company case, your portion of it, for the documentation work, it's enough to go somewhere and start properly. Harlow was specific about that. He looked at the table. You have options now that you didn't have when you arrived. I know, she said. I want you to know that I know that, he said. Whatever you decide, I want you to decide it with the full picture. She looked at him across the table. This man who had prepared a wool crate before she arrived and fixed a window and told her difficult truths and stood in a yard with the Ridgeland Company bearing down on him and held the line. Who had spent the last year becoming incrementally more honest with himself, which was the hardest kind of honest and the most necessary. Who was sitting across from her right now offering her the door because he thought she deserved to walk through it freely, which she did, and which was also exactly why she wasn't going to. You know why I asked for the year, she said. You wanted to be sure, he said. I wanted to decide, she said. There's a difference. She held his eyes. A year ago, I didn't have choices. You bought my contract at an auction, and I came here because I had nowhere else to go and a daughter to keep alive. If I'd stayed past the year because of that, because of habit, or because leaving was hard, or because there was nothing obvious to go to, that would have been the same version of not quite freedom in different clothing. She stopped. I needed to stay until I knew I was choosing it, not falling into it. He was very still across the table. Are you? He said, quietly. Choosing it? Yes, she said, simply, without decoration, in the same register he used when he said the things he meant most. Yes, I am. The lamp between them burned. Outside, the October wind moved through the yard and the horses stirred in the corral, and somewhere on the south range there were 4 ranch hands examining a fence that probably didn't need examining, giving 2 people at a kitchen table the time they needed. Cole reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hand was large and rough-palmed and warm, and it rested over hers with the particular weight of something that has been patient for a long time and is no longer required to be. She turned her hand over under his, and his fingers closed around hers, and they sat like that for a while without saying anything, which was its own kind of conversation. I'm not easy to live with, he said finally. I want you to know that I know that. I know you're not, she said. I'm not particularly easy either. No, he agreed, and there was something in his voice that was warm enough to be called affectionate. You are not. We'll manage, she said. We already have been, he said. She thought about that. It was true, in the way that the most important truths tend to be. Obvious once named, but requiring the naming to become visible. They had been managing for a year. Through the Ledger and the Ridge Land Company and the South Draw and the Marshal's Room and the 3 days of waiting in March. They had been 2 people working on adjacent problems in the same house, and at some point the adjacency had become something else. The way riverbanks become river. Gradually and then entirely. There's something I want to say, she said. All right. I was not a woman who needed rescuing, she said. I want to be clear about that. Not then, not now. What I needed was a fair starting point, and you gave me one. What happened after that starting point was, she paused, choosing the words carefully, because this mattered, and she wanted to get it right. It was both of us. The 2 of us and Tom and Dutch and Edna and all of it. I don't want to tell a story later about being saved. I want to tell the real one. He looked at her with something in his face that she could only call respect. The clean kind, not the performative kind that men sometimes offered women as a substitute for actual regard. That is the real one, he said. I know it. Good, she said. Then we understand each other. We do, he said. We have for a while, I think. She looked at their joined hands on the kitchen table. She thought about the woman who had stood on an auction platform 6 months pregnant with grief and stubborn enough to meet 200 people's eyes without flinching. And she thought about what that woman had understood, that she hadn't been given credit for, that survival was not the ceiling, only the floor, and that what you built on top of it was the actual question. What she had built, in a year, on the floor of an October auction in a bruised sky square, was this: a room that was hers. A daughter who stood unaided and clapped her hands with authority, a household she ran with her name on the accounts, a friendship with a gray-haired rancher who talked to her child about fencing, an alliance with a woman who told her to take the credit, and a man across a kitchen table whose hand was warm and whose word was good. It was not a fairy story. There was no version of this that was a fairy story. Not with the years of paying a blackmail that shouldn't have existed. Not with a brother frozen in the dark. Not with 3 families who lost farms they never got back. Not with Clara's $43 and the jar of beans she still kept on the pantry shelf as a habit she didn't try to break. Real things don't resolve cleanly. They resolve the way frontier country resolves into spring, slowly, incompletely, with patches of cold remaining longer than seems fair, and then one morning you step outside and the air is different, and you understand that the season turned without announcing itself. She didn't need the announcement. She had the air. They married in April, when the South Range was green and Nora was 14 months old, and had strong opinions about walking versus being carried, which she expressed clearly and at volume. The ceremony was small because neither of them wanted a large thing. Tom as witness, Hector in his best shirt looking genuinely moved, Edna Marsh in the front row of the 8 people assembled in the Cole Ridge yard with an expression of grim satisfaction that was, from Edna, indistinguishable from joy. Nora sat on Tom's knee during the short civil ceremony performed by the Justice of the Peace from Blackstone Ridge, and watched the proceedings with the focused attention she brought to everything. And at the moment when Cole took Clara's hand, she reached both arms toward him with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who had already decided this was right and saw no reason not to say so. Cole picked her up. He held her against his shoulder during the remainder of the ceremony with the particular ease of a man who has been doing this for months without acknowledging that it has become natural to him. And Nora put her fist in his collar and leaned her head against his jaw and closed her eyes, which was a thing she only did when she felt completely safe. Clara watched this and thought, there it is. Not the marriage itself, that was real, and it mattered, and she had chosen it with the full weight of her intelligence and her history. But the image of a man holding a child who trusted him completely in the April sun, on the land he'd spent 3 years almost losing and 1 year learning to keep for the right reasons. There it was. The thing she'd been building toward without knowing exactly what it would look like. She had thought, back in October of the previous year, lying on a real mattress in a room that smelled of old stone and wood smoke, that she was starting over with nothing. She had been wrong about the nothing. She'd had $43 and a 4-month-old daughter and her own capable hands and the habit of paying attention, and she'd had the particular stubborn knowledge that the floor was not the ceiling and that what you did with a starting point was more important than the starting point itself. The rest had been the work. The rest had been showing up and doing the work. The ledger and the supply lists and the window repairs and the 5:30 mornings and the hard conversations and the plan in the South draw and the attorney's letter and every other ordinary and extraordinary act of a woman who had decided that this place was worth fighting for before anyone had asked her to fight for it. No one gives you a home. You recognize it, and then you build it, and then you keep building it, and the building is the point, not the finished thing, which is never really finished, but the fact of hands that know the work and a will that shows up for it day after day. Clara knew this. She had always known it. She had just needed the starting point and the year and the man across the kitchen table who was honest with her even when it was inconvenient, and the daughter who clapped her hands and reached for what she wanted without apology. She took Cole's free hand and held it. He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them, Nora opened her eyes and looked at both of them in turn and seemed to find the arrangement satisfactory. Years passed the way years pass on frontier land, with weather and work and loss and stubbornness and the slow accumulation of things that matter. Cole Ridge grew. The herd expanded. Tom Briggs stayed, as Tom Briggs had always been going to stay, and he watched Nora become a girl who could ride before she started school and who cross-examined every adult she encountered with the relentless precision of someone who has been told from infancy that questions are worth asking. Edna Marsh remained a presence in their lives, not quite family and more than neighbor, showing up unannounced when something needed saying and leaving when she'd said it, which was, everyone agreed, exactly the right frequency for Edna. Hector's back got worse and then better, and then worse again, and he retired at 68 to a small house in Blackstone Ridge that Cole bought for him, and cried when he left, and came to supper every other Sunday and gave opinions about the quality of the current cook that were delivered entirely in Spanish and mostly accurate. The valley recovered slowly and imperfectly, the way valleys recover from the particular damage that greed does to them. The Hellers came back. Some of the invalidated contracts resolved in the original owner's favor. Some did not. The Ridgeland Company principals faced proceedings that took 2 years and resulted in judgments that were satisfying to no one and better than nothing, which is the usual outcome of justice applied to systematic harm. It changes the future more than it repairs the past, and you learn to accept that and keep going. Cole never stopped being the kind of man who carried things quietly. That didn't change. But there is a difference between a man carrying things alone because he believes he has to, and a man carrying things alongside someone who knows the weight and has decided to help with it. And Clara understood this difference from inside it now. She understood it on the evenings when she found him sitting with the thought of his brother in the way she'd learned to recognize. And she sat nearby without demanding he speak, and eventually he either did or didn't, and both were all right. She understood it in the household accounts that had her handwriting in every entry for going on 5 years, the clean record of a place that knew its own resources and used them well. She understood it in the conversations they had late at night. When the house was quiet and the children were asleep, Nora in the room she'd claimed as her own with the thoroughness of a small general, and the son who had come 3 years after the wedding and who had Cole's angular face and apparently Claire's particular habit of refusing to accept an answer that wasn't fully sourced. She understood it in the way the ranch ran. Not perfectly, never perfectly, with weather losses and difficult seasons, and the ongoing negotiations that come with running anything among people who all have their own ideas. But honestly, and with a reputation in the valley that had been built slowly and held, one afternoon in late summer, Clara stood on the porch of the house that had been a stranger's and was now entirely hers, and looked at the yard where Nora was teaching her brother something involving a length of rope and strong opinions, and at the south range where the herd was visible in the afternoon light, and at the road that came up from Blackstone Ridge through the tree line and ended here. She thought about a woman standing on an auction platform with an infant in her arms, and 200 people watching and nowhere to go. She thought about what that woman had known that nobody gave her credit for. She thought, you don't get to choose the starting point, you get to choose what you do from it. That woman had chosen to pay attention, to ask questions, to do the work in front of her even when the work was hard and the outcome was unclear, to stay when staying was the right thing and not because she had no other option, to build something on a floor that had looked, at the time, like very nearly nothing. What she had built was this: the porch under her feet and the yard in front of her and the sound of her daughter's voice carrying across the afternoon and the man somewhere behind her in the house, whose footsteps she knew better than she knew her own. What she had built was a life that was hers in the fullest sense of the word. Not given, not arranged, not survived, but made, by her own hands, from the available materials, over the years it took to make it. The available materials had been imperfect. She had been imperfect. Everything about it had been imperfect and real and fully worth the doing. Nora looked up from the rope lesson and waved at her from the yard. Clara waved back. Behind her the door opened and Cole came out onto the porch and stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at, and she moved slightly sideways so that their shoulders were together, and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that in the late summer light, watching the yard and the range and the road, two imperfect people in an imperfect place that they had, together, and stubbornly, and over the course of years, made into something that deserved the word home. It was enough. More than enough. It was, in the only way that has ever mattered, everything.